us into our issue discussion for today, which relates to the DC Bar's task force on reimagining the district's jails and justice. And so we have with us two panelists who were part of that effort, and they're going to share with us the way that data was used, not only to identify what particular issues existed, but also to offer recommendations for how to improve the state of criminal justice in the district. So I am happy to welcome Emily and Shelley today. I will read their bios and then we will get right into it. Okay, so Emily Tatro is Deputy Director of the Council for Court Excellence, known as CCE, in Washington, D.C. Emily led CCE's reentry initiatives to effect reforms to help people returning from incarceration and their support networks. Through her involvement with various coalitions, Emily has monitored developing criminal justice issues to identify opportunities for CCE to effect change. Before joining CCE, Emily was the Criminal and Disability Rights Fellow for the DC Jail and Prison Advocacy Project at Disability Rights DC, which is a program of University Legal Services. And previously, Emily, like I, was a teacher, and she was located in Chicago. Welcome, Emily, and thank you for joining us. We also have with us Shelley Broderick, who is the Dean Emerita, and Joseph L. Raw Jr., Chair of Social Justice at the University of the District of Columbia, David A. Clark School of Law. Shelley served as interim and then dean from August 1998 to June 2018. She began her academic career as a clinical faculty member, where she directed the Criminal Defense Clinic at the Antioch School of Law for 10 years, representing more than 2,000 individuals charged with crimes in the Superior and District Courts of DC. She also co-directed the Legislation Clinic for 4 years, where she supervised students working primarily on health and safety, environmental justice, and criminal justice legislation with the DC Council. Shelley chairs the DC Task Force on Jails and Justice, and this Blue Ribbon Task Force is charged with redefining and reinventing the District of Columbia criminal justice system and ensuring that the jail is just one part of a just and equitable system. Thank you, Shelley. It's good to have both you and Emily here with us. So let's just, before we actually dig into how data was used, we want to make sure that our participants have an understanding of what the task force is, how long it's been around, and what it's been charged to do. So Shelley, as the chair of the task force, could you give us an overview of it, please?
I'd be glad to. Thank you so much, Megan. It's nice to meet another Hoya lawyer. I think yes. Emily, you and I are all Hoya lawyers. For those who are not in the know, that's Georgetown. So I am so happy to talk about the work of the task force, especially with Emily, who is the brains of the operation and stalwart leader. We are a 26-member, very blue ribbon task force. And so we had the United States Attorney, the public defender, the Attorney General for DC, Charles Allen, the chair of the DC Council Committee on Judiciary and Public Safety, the head of the Washington Lawyers Committee on Civil Rights, and countless others, including re-entering citizens, those with lived experience. We had academics, policy leaders, practitioners, advocates, and service providers. So it was a group of people who had real juice as well as real experience. And it was it has been a 2-year process from spring of 2019. In the first phase, we published a report that kind of was the blueprint for where we were going. We divided into 4 committees. They were decarceration, local control. How do we take local control of our criminal justice system, which is run a lot by the feds in DC, unlike any place else in the country. Community investments and alternatives to incarceration. And finally, actual facilities. What should a jail look like? So where we started off was, everyone agrees that the current jail in DC isn't working. And for a whole bunch of reasons, horrible, outdated facilities that don't have room for the kinds of programming and activities that you would want if you want to have successful outcomes. If you want to have people release and successfully re-enter society with the skills they need, and so forth. So first we took a look at who's in the jail. Who is in the jail? And here's where the data begins to tell a horrible story. Let's lead with one data point. DC is 47% African-American, but who's locked up? 86% of the people locked up are Black. What's up with that? How can that be? 92% of the people who are locked up are from the poorest and Blackest wards. Gee, that's interesting. Why do we lock up people from wards 5, 7, and 8? And not from other wards? What's up with that? And so we decided to not just say, well, we need a better building, with better facilities, but who should be in the jail? So first we look at who's in the jail, and then are these the people who we feel actually need secure detention? Well, again, the data tells a story, and I'm gonna bring Emily in a second, but just for example, 20% of the people on any given day who are locked up on parole revocation issues that have to do with typically drug use or missed meetings, technical violations. 20% of the people, and they tend to be locked up for 2 to 7 days. Gee, do they really need to be locked up? We're paying $241 a day for everybody who's locked up, and the people who are locked up aren't taking care of their children. They aren't taking care of the seniors in their lives. They're not going to work because they're locked up. And that sets off cascading consequences because they aren't making a paycheck and they lose their housing. Now the kids are out of school because they're, it's a terrible situation. Let's not lock people up for technical violations. So the whole purpose of the task force, we developed, I'm gonna give you the formal language. We are dedicated to redefining the district's approach to incarceration by building citywide engagement, by centering the voices of those with lived experiences, understanding community priorities, and exploring the use and design of secure detention and community-based solutions. We've worked to build a humane, equitable approach to criminal justice in Washington, D.C. that prioritizes prevention and care and reimagines accountability through a rehabilitative lens to create safe and thriving communities. And I'll just do a little more. The task force released its phase 2 report, Our Transformation Starts Today, in February of 2021. And we made 80 recommendations designed to be implemented over a 10-year period, resulting in major investments in community safety, lowering incarceration rates by half, regaining local control of DC's criminal justice system, building a new facility to hold our reduced pretrial, and sentenced populations, and ending the over-incarceration of Black people in DC. These 80 recommendations were developed from the analysis of jails and prison data, research on other jurisdictions, and engagement with over 2,500 DC residents, including 500 currently incarcerated people. And each recommendation was approved by at least 70% of the members of the task force. Emily, do you want to tell us what I should have said?
Megan, was there something else you wanted us to like hone in on specifically, or should I talk through some of the data that we gathered?
So the first question is just kind of an overview of what the task force was. Perhaps you could share why you became involved in the task force. We know that you're part of CCE, so was it in that role, and what were you hoping to benefit from the experience?
Yeah, so the Council for Court Excellence had the idea to build this task force when Mayor Bowser back in 2017 said that she was getting ready to issue a request for proposals, an RFP, for a public-private corporation to come and build a new jail in DC. And a lot of advocates in the community said, hold on, what do you mean you're taking bids in 30 days? We, haven't talked about why we need a jail or what we want out of a jail. We haven't answered these really big questions before spending, presumably about $500 million building a new facility. And it would be a shame to not get answers to those questions first. And so we were able to halt that RFP process at the time, and then went to DC Council and asked them to set aside funding to really do the deep work of digging in here. It's one thing to have a PR process gathering information like this, right? It's another thing to have a really deep, engaged, community-based effort to do so. And so the DC Council set aside some money in the budget, granted it out, and CCE won that grant and partnered with the National Reentry Network for Returning Citizens, which is a local organization of formerly incarcerated people here in DC, to build up the task force and to conduct its work over the 2-year period. So we helped to, we recruited the task force members, we helped to do the on the ground community engagement work, we collected and analyzed the data, we helped to draft the committee reports based on the task force members' leadership and questions and participants. In addition to the 26 task force members, we recruited another 30 or so advisors from the community. And we're able to take all of this information together to really sort through and figure out what it is that DC residents were prioritizing, what safety meant to them, what they thought the proper role of a correctional facility should be, and to design these recommendations. In the second report, when we issued the 80 recommendations, we issued each one of them with an implementation plan that included information on what success would look like, how to measure that, the impact on Black people and other special populations in DC, the exact steps that, who needed to do what, when, and how to accomplish the goals, and how much it would cost. And so we really did put together a very comprehensive 10-year plan to get us to the ultimate goals that were set by this task force.
Thanks. That's very great context. And even the beginnings of the task force, it was developed in response to something that was happening that the community was not on board with. And so that's another example of kind of community and stakeholders coming together in order to, you may not be able to completely rectify the issue at the very outset, but you can at least do enough to hit the pause button in order to allow some time and some space for research and for collecting data and stories. I thought it was extremely helpful that you highlighted who all participated in the process, because it's, the people, as Shelley referred, the people with juice who actually have the power to be able to carry through on some of these recommendations. But then you also have the populations that whatever recommendations go forth are going to impact. And so making sure that you have all of the voices that need to be considered is another powerful part. And it relates to our earlier keynote when we're talking about stories and how stories are catalysts as well as data to help underscore and to, reach individuals in a different way. And so I think that lends itself to our deeper discussion about data specifically. So Shelley, in her contextual overview, shared some data points that were collected. And I know that there's lots more data that was collected and analyzed in order to help develop the 80 recommendations that are part of the task force report. So if we could just talk a little bit about the impact and the influence. So what types of data were you collecting and how did that impact or influence the ultimate set of recommendations?
I wanted to, go ahead.
I was going to say, I can give an overview of what we collected and you can talk as a task force member how that impacted your decision making. So we did both quantitative and kind of more qualitative data analysis. We gathered data from existing sources and we made new data ourselves. So first and foremost, we got population data, like Shelley explained, both from the DC Department of Corrections, which runs our jails that hold people pre-trial or sentenced to misdemeanors here in DC. And we pretty miraculously also got data from the Federal Bureau of Prisons, which holds people who are sentenced to felony terms to a year or more. We, because DC's system is so broken into local and federal pieces, a lot of the federal actors don't share information with DC on a regular basis, even government actors, let alone outside advocates. And so we were frankly a little shocked at how much information they produced for us. And a lot of it was stuff that we were seeing for the first time. The top charges of everyone who was incarcerated, the disability status, the classes people had taken, all kinds of data that we had never seen before. And so that was really useful and insightful for us, particularly when we were looking at decarceration, because there are essentially two ways to bring down incarcerated populations. One is putting fewer people in jail, but the other is having people serve shorter terms and releasing them sooner. And so we had to have those prison numbers in order to know who was in there and who might be eligible under policy changes for some kind of early release. We also surveyed more than 2,000 DC residents about we asked people, this is pre-pandemic, we got this done. So we had it, spreading on listservs and social media, but we also had people standing at metro stops and going to summer block events and, with iPads and having people take the survey right there and asking them questions about what safety meant to them and what role they thought a jail should be playing. It's really hard and takes a lot of resources to gather information from a survey at that level. And it's something that doesn't get done very often in DC, but something that I think was really impactful because you can take that to elected leaders and say, hey, these are your constituents. These are people who are involved, who are paying attention, who live in DC and who have really strong opinions about this. You should be listening. And the other piece of information that we collected was a survey actually of people who were currently serving terms in the Bureau of Prisons. So we had almost 500 people out of the more than 3,000 respond to our survey to talk about what kind of incarceration facility would be ideal for them if they were in. Would they rather be in the BOP or to come home to DC? What kind of reentry supports that they think they needed? We had to get really creative about how to involve not just formerly incarcerated people who could come to our meetings and participate on the outside, but how we could get inside too. We conducted a lot of focus groups and collected more qualitative data there. We held focus groups inside the jail with incarcerated people. We held them with correctional officials, with people who lived in the neighborhood of the jail, with people who were victims of crime, with anyone who had kind of a stakeholder touch or any kind of special interest in the jail facilities here in DC. And I think that real mix of the hard data and the storytelling and being able to come with real hard information from lots of different sources was really useful. But I'll let Shelley explain how that impacted her thinking.
Well, thank you. I have to say, hearing people talk about their experience just makes a huge difference. And so we were in every ward. We had town hall meetings and again, focus groups, hearings, and the whole survey process. And it just made a difference. People, one thing we know that everybody agrees on is that the jail's not working. It's not doing what it's supposed to do. We heard a lot about another example of this kind of work, which was New Beginnings. DC used to have one of the worst, most horrific juvenile lockup facility called Oak Hill. People literally died there. It was drugs were everywhere. The educational programming was horrible. It was rat infested. It was awful, and it was far out in the suburbs. So families had a hard time getting there. I mean, it was every single thing was bad. And they decided, okay, we're going to build a new one. And the same thing, the exact plan was to kind of build one where they could lock up the same number of kids. And wise heads prevailed. And they studied who is currently locked up. Is it benefiting them? Are they getting out and having successful reentry? Oh, you know what the answer is there. No. I mean, it's where they were learning their craft as criminals. That's who their mentors were, right? The older kids who were successful drug dealers and so forth. So DC ultimately built New Beginnings, and it's a model for the nation. And it has secured detention for about 50 kids instead of a couple thousand. And it has been, again, enormously successful. So with that in mind, and some of the data points, for example, 62% of the people locked up have either a serious mental illness or substance abuse issue, or both. How about if we helped people with their substance abuse and serious mental illness ahead of time, before they get involved with the criminal justice system, so that we can avoid incarceration? It's not doing a drug addict any good to be locked up. It's a good idea to address the substance abuse issues in the community. And so let's invest in the community instead of, again, we spend $88,000 a year to lock somebody up. $88,000. What if we spent that money on community investments to address those issues? We know that when police go to address a mental health, somebody having a mental health crisis, so often that goes south. So often that results in shooting or in other, in bad outcomes all the way around. How about if when there's a mental health crisis, people who are trained to do mental health in interventions go, maybe with police from time to time, but for the most part, we're just going to have much better outcomes. There's an article in the paper today about this approach happening in Albuquerque. It just makes sense. So let's do that again. Invest in the community instead of in having people locked up. And as Emily said, in DC we lock people up, far more people for far longer than we need to. We know that in developed countries around the world, they have dramatically shorter sentences And dramatically fewer people are locked up. And that's, again, some of the data we looked at internationally as well as nationally. What are best practices? What are folks doing to address these things? So two of the other data points, and then I'll shut up. We know that police stops in cars, they tend to stop Black men in certain wards. And a huge percentage, something like 20% of those stops result in searches and result in arrests. And oftentimes, and Emily may know the numbers, those people are released. The prosecutors don't choose to prosecute them. But meanwhile, we've locked Black men up in traffic stops. How about if the Department of Transportation sends photographs of infractions instead of the police stopping people? And except in the case of public safety issue, DDOT can do that work, and it won't result in the disproportionate arrests of Black men. And with the confluence of the racial reckoning and the pandemic, we saw that happen, right? All of a sudden, we stopped stopping people. We sent photographs for infractions, and we're none the worse. We're better, and a lot fewer people. We ended up decarcerating by about 30%. How about finally, we know that we have police in schools. And then when boys, particularly boys of color, who all the studies show are perceived as more dangerous and older than they actually are, we end up arresting a lot of kids in school when we don't have to. And they tend to be Black kids, particularly boys. How about if we have social workers and other trained people in the schools instead of police? So these are the kinds of recommendations the task force made, concrete recommendations, policy, procedures, legislative, huge percentage of these are directed at things the legislature has already done on a temporary basis. Things the police can do, things the courts can do that they've already done on a temporary basis because of the pandemic and because of the racial reckoning. And let's make those real and continuing. And that's how we're going to take the steps we need to do to reduce the incarceration rate and to shorten the sentences. And so Emily maybe can give us some of the terrific recommendations we've made.
Yeah, I think the data really helped us get from a general level. You can talk about America's criminal justice system and generally agree that, Black people and other people of color are overrepresented, and, we have too long of sentences and we do these things. But the reality is that we don't have an American criminal justice system. We have a really, really broken down in small buckets. We have thousands of criminal justice systems in this country, and DC's system is a little bit different than everyone else's. And the people that we lock up and the laws that we use to do it and the policies that we use to do it are a little bit different than everyone else's. And so when you're talking about making change, it's getting grabbing people's attention and making them care. Speaking in those generalities can be a really good way of explaining the issues in an accessible way. But when you're looking to actually change law, change policy, you have to get really, really detailed, and the data helped us get there. So for instance, one of the things that gets talked about on the federal level a lot is, the drug sentencing disparity, and, crack cocaine is sentenced at X number of times over powder cocaine, and how do we address that? In DC, that's not an issue. In DC, we have about 3,200 people serving prison sentences right now. and 33 of them are serving drug sentences. So drug sentences are not our big issue here, right? They're longer than they have to be. They're an average of 8 years, which is probably longer than it needs to be. I'm not saying nothing can be done, but that's not where we're going to really make a huge difference in our system, right? Half of the people serving prison sentences in DC are serving charges of homicide or aggravated assault. So we actually need to look at those violent crimes and figure out how to really address those issues. Something else that's, a little bit different in DC is that we hold 20% of the people in jail on DC charges are there because of violations of probation, parole, or supervised release. 20%. That's enormous. 1 in 5 people at our DC jail. And that is somewhere, where the US Parole Commission makes decisions right now. And if we localize that decision making, instead of allowing the federal government to continue with that authority, we could change the reasons that we're bringing people back. We could stop bringing them back on technical violations like missed meetings or, dirty drug tests. And we could stop holding them when they're arrested on a new charge that doesn't play out. This is also somewhere where we actually do see people in jail for drug offenses. So we don't see people in prison in DC on drug offenses, but 11% of our jail population is there for drug offenses. Why? If they're not going to prison, you know what I mean? Like, why do they need to be in jail? We know that almost 2/3 of the jail population is, if they're incarcerated at all, is less than a week. So if you're there for less than 7 days, why do you need to be in jail at all? Is that actually making our city safer? Is that, what is the purpose being served there? And are we actually accomplishing the goal that we laid out for ourselves? Another really interesting thing about DC's jail population is that actually a full third of our jail population aren't there serving DC sentence or for DC charges at all. They're people who are there for federal charges or who we are holding and we get paid to hold, or we're holding for Maryland or Virginia, mostly for the federal government. And so, we have a decision to make. We could build a much smaller facility if we gave up housing those people for the federal government. And we could, have a much smaller population here if we said, okay, we don't want to earn money off of holding people for the feds. You're going to have to find someone else to do that for you. So there are a lot of ways that, each population, we're not special. Everyone is a little bit different, right? And there are so many ways that the data really bears that out and leads us to the real solutions that we need to address. We ended up analyzing all of this data and figured out a path to cutting DC's incarcerated population by half over the next 10 years. And that's something that we could prove is possible because we could run the scenarios. We could say, okay, if we let people apply for early release after 10 years instead of 15, how many people might get out of prison? If we said we weren't going to house people for first time technical violations of probation or parole, how many people would that get out of jail? And that really detailed level let us do population projections for the future and make a really confident recommendation that we can get our total combined population down to 3,000 to 4,000 people. And that's small enough that we can build a facility here in DC that houses both people pre-trial and people who are sentenced so that everyone can come home for the first time in 20 years. And whoever is left incarcerated can at least be in the district and be close to family and other support systems.
You know that we have people in DC prisoners are in 122 facilities, every Bureau of prison in the country. And, when you're all over the country and you can't get back and the families can't visit you, again, it has a terrible negative impact on the outcomes, on successful reentry.
Thank you both. That is a very great overview of the role that data played, not only in identifying the aspects of the issue that were most prominent and particularly needed to be addressed, but also how that worked itself into not only the recommendations, but the actual timeline to reach the ultimate goal that you shared of reducing the incarceration rate by 50% within 10 years. Before I get to the next question, I do want to note for the participants that Emily has shared a link to access the task force report. And she noted that it does include detailed data analyses as well. So that is something that can serve as a resource for you if you would like more information specific to the task force report, but also to get a better understanding of the data items that were collected and analyzed. One thing I noticed that Shelley and Emily, you both shared was you gave the statistics, but you also gave the story with it in order for us to be able to actually visualize who is being impacted, what is happening. And I'm sure that we will have more questions related to the process that you all use. But I do want to ask, you're giving the data point with the story, but then you have this written report that needs to get sent out. So how do you go about maintaining the humanity in the data? Because we know that the data deals with people, and we know that, the issue itself is, people facing, not only those who are incarcerated, but the families and the community that it affects. And so how do you present the data in a way that reserves the humanity? Before you answer that question, though, I do need to put in a plug for our participants that we do welcome your questions. So please use the Q&A box because we will probably get to questions in the next 7 minutes or so. And we would like to have them ready to go.
It's just such a great question, Megan, and I so appreciate your asking that. We have taken this show on the road, and we have, using members of the task force, including those with lived experience, including returning citizens who've actually lived it, and we have done briefings for the DC Council and the DC Superior Court and the DC Court of Appeals and the DC Bar and the Consortium of Legal Services Providers and on and on and on, ANC, organization all over the city, people telling the stories. And so one of the guys who's often with us, Tyrone, spent a year, he was revoked for having his system showed marijuana use. Marijuana, by the way, is legal in DC, but he was revoked and spent another year in prison, during which time his mother died. It's tragic. Here's an incredibly accomplished a wonderful guy. Who's worked so hard on this commission and helped educate all of us, but telling those stories where you can meet Tyrone. Here's a guy who went through that for stupid reason. A technical violation of parole, a year of his life gone, wasted. So Emily, I'm sure you can add to that.
Yeah, certainly one of the ways is cutting out the middleman and letting people speak for themselves. That was part of the reason that we made sure that we had so many returning citizens on the task force and representatives of the survivor community. Another thing that I like to do is to use photographs and pictures to remind us that there are real people, right? So in this particular report, we tried to keep it as focused and streamlined as possible. But if I may, I'm going to see if I can share my screen here briefly. Yeah. We really love, or one of the pictures that I love to show is, sorry, this one here. Can everyone see this?
Yeah.
And This is a picture, I don't know if people saw in the news last month, it was the 50th anniversary of the Attica Rebellion at a prison in New York that really set off a generation of prisoners' rights movements. And in 1972, shortly after the Attica Rebellion, there was an uprising here at the DC jail. And they took hostages. It ended up being negotiated and ended non-violently and kicked off a lawsuit that went on for decades and had the jail under court supervision. But this is a picture of some of the men at DC jail who led the uprising and their list of demands. And one of their demands was that no one be punished directly for their role in the uprising. And I like to share this because even though the picture was taken almost 50 years ago, the people, when you walk into DC jail, look pretty much the same today. And it's, I think, a good reminder that even when we're talking about data and numbers and policy and law, what we're really talking about is people and the way that our systems and our society impact human beings. And I think this is a helpful reminder of that for me.
Thank you for sharing, Emily. So we do have some questions that have come in. And so I would like to get those addressed. And then I do have some of my own as well. But let's start with our participant questions. I think one thing that recurred during our conversation was noting the many other entities that are involved or that are impacted by incarceration and who gets incarcerated and, you know, what other issues may they be dealing with that are not being helped by them being incarcerated. So one of our participants asked, how do we reduce the 20% population that are in for parole violations or those other technicalities or issues related to probation offenses? And so we know that that is, you know, a separate entity who determines whether parole has been violated and what the repercussions are there. But what strategies did the data suggest or might have been included as recommendations in the task force report specific to that population?
So the first thing that we know that we need to do is get local control back over paroling authority. And that's because there's literally nothing we can do right now. The U.S. Parole Commission makes all of those decisions. The courts have decided that they do not need to apply DC's local rules to their decisions. And so we have zero control over that right now. We would have to get congressional action to close the U.S. Parole Commission and bring that authority back to DC. That is something that appears possible and on the table. There's actually a sunset clause built into the 1997 Revitalization Act that gave our parole authority away. And right now it's set to expire next year, although I suspect that we will be seeing an extension soon. Because unfortunately, there is a big debate among local advocates about whether the paroling authority should be moved to DC Superior Court, where judges would make those parole grant and revocation decisions in the future, or whether we should constitute a DC Board of Parole to make those decisions. There are lots of, frankly, good arguments on both sides, right? Judges are the highest caliber of person trained to do this type of thing. You know, they protect due process at all costs. It would not be an expansion of the criminal legal system. On the other hand, our courts are federally appointed judges. We don't actually have local control over them or their budget. They have, they're down almost 20% judicial capacity right now and are really strained, and we have no oversight or authority over them. A local board could end up repeating the failures of lots of other parole boards in other places. On the other hand, we have our own budget and our own oversight and our own control, and we can put in place people to make those decisions who are returning citizens, who care about our DC community. So the first step is really making a decision and forcing the mayor and the DC council to make a decision about which way we need to go. The task force honestly could not come to a recommendation there. CCE as an organization endorses the board model. But once that decision is made, the task force included, if you look in the 9th section of recommendations of the second report, starting on page 69, a series of recommendations about once we have local control, how we can change things. So we can set a maximum probation period of 2 years so that people aren't on probation forever and at risk of being, revoked, messing up and being revoked for such a long time. Same with supervised release. We can establish earned discharge credits, which are the same as earning good time in prison, where if you're on good behavior, you get a couple days off every month for your sentence. You can do the same thing, and many places have, for probation, parole, supervised release. We can change. One of the things that we saw that was a really huge benefit during the height of the pandemic was that our supervision agencies, CSOSA, which supervises people on parole and supervised release and probation, they decided, oh, we can't take the risk of having in-person contacts. We're going to switch to video phone calls to check in with everyone. And it made a huge difference in people's lives, right? It costs money, it costs time to go down to the probation office and check in with your officer. Some people, I've had clients who, came home after years in solitary confinement, and going and sitting in a waiting room with dozens of other people around and all of that chaos was too much for them to handle. And so having those video call check-ins and reducing the number of in-time appearances or in-person appearances can make a huge difference for people's ability to keep up with the rules. We can also just make it so that you can't get revoked for a first-time technical violation. Anything that's breaking a rule but isn't breaking a law means that you get sanctioned in some other way, but you're not going back to jail. So there are a lot of things we can do to change that population once we're able to control the rules of the process again.
Great, thank you, Emily. And that is, another indication that it's a complex problem. And so it requires complex solution discussions. And, in some cases, one thing needs to happen first in order to actually have the authority or the capability to enact more changes. And so thank you for demonstrating how the task force report lays out, if this happens, then now we're able to do all of these other things, because I think that helps orient not only to the issue, but to what steps are needed, especially if this is a series of steps that are being implemented over a year's long period. It's helpful to kind of get the framing in mind. Another question that we had come in related to the politics aspect of things. So we know that the task force consisted of a lot of members in government or other high positions, but we also know that the only reason that the task force was first created was because of stakeholder feedback after an announcement that DC was going to move forward with something that had not gotten the broader community's input. So how do you propose, or how do you work toward actually getting these recommendations implemented? How do you build a majority on the DC Council? How do you get around political obstacles, whether it be people in government or people in the highest position on government? How do we work to actually get these recommendations passed and implemented?
Well, that's another great question, Megan. Thank you for that. Emily and her team at CCE has done a terrific job in really focusing the presentations that we make to community organizations and political groups on what you can do now. And so when we met with the DC Council, we blocked out the pieces of legislation that they can work on. We've also organized hearings when they are considering, for example, I testified last week, as did dozens of other people, in favor of redefining the definition of child, right? Right now, the United States Attorney, who, by the way, is appointed by the President of the United States, not from DC, not an elected person, not accountable to DC in any way, they have the option of prosecuting for serious felonies kids who are 16 and 17 and 18. So they go directly to adult prison. They're completely in the adult system, as opposed to the family system, where the judge can take into account rehabilitation and all of the things in a family context we would want to decide before we prosecuted somebody. If we redefine the child as 18 or above, and the task force has said it should be 25, or is it 25 or 21? 21, sorry. So, we know all the science says that young people's brains aren't fully formed till they're 25. So I personally think it should be 25, and a lot of other advocates do. But at least 21, we don't let you buy a lottery ticket or a drink until you're at least 18, right? But we can prosecute you as a criminal through the criminal system, where 16 and 17-year-old boys are locked up in adult prison, and we all know what happens. It is devastating to them. And so, we're focused on taking that message and really packing those hearings and making the case with the stories of people who've had lived experience, and with the data that we've collected as we're advocating for the changes that the task force has recommended. That's just one example of countless others.
And we really, when we published the 80 recommendations this year, we divided them up into 3 stages. The first stage is 6 years and really gives us time to enact policy change, because we really want to start bringing those population levels down before we start any construction on a new facility. So we gave ourselves the time to do it. Part of it is, like we said, getting to as many people as possible, right? People who are in leadership positions make changes when they feel pressured to do so. And so making sure that as many people in the public as possible who are active in DC political and civic life know what's going on and are well-versed and know how to talk about these issues, making sure that we're getting as much attention in the press as possible. It's something people don't like to talk about, but you absolutely have to advocate for coverage on issues, and we 100% see more action when something is published in the Post or in the city paper or on WAMU than if we're just talking about it on Twitter by ourselves, right? And then really the other thing is making it easy for them. People are busy, they have their own set of priorities. Staffs at DC Council are fairly small. And so we are recruiting help, to draft some of this legislation, to do the work for them. We right now are working with a law firm that has about 20 of the recommendations that will lead to decarceration in DC, that's drafting a bill for us. And we're going to, circulate that around, get feedback from task force members, and then ask one of the DC Council members to introduce it for us, because, it is incumbent upon us to make sure that the ball is moving forward and that it's being carried, right? We can't do all the work ourselves, but we can figure out who has the power to make the change and build pressure on them to do the right thing.
Thank you both. And thanks to David for that question, because it underscores the role that each of us can play as advocates and as volunteers in order to make sure that this issue is top of mind and that the people who are able to enact the change actually know that it's what the stakeholders and the community wants to see. And I think we'll just close out with one question from Jorge. And I think I already know the answer to it, but I think it's a good wrap up. And so are we hopeful that criminal justice reform is moving in the right direction? I mean, the task force has been working on this project for over 2 years. We have the recommendations. We know where we want to go. Where do you see this going in the future? and what role will data continue to play in creating this reality?
Well, I certainly am hopeful, and we've already seen some of our recommendations come to be, and others are in the pipeline, and I believe they will come to be. It's just too important. It's just too important. And again, when you have a broken system and you shine a light on that over and over and over again, you're going to get change. This is the moment. You know, it was like a miracle when we started this commission. The idea that the DC jail would reduce its incarceration level by 30% in a year. What? You know, but again, the confluence of the pandemic and the racial reckoning, we had to do things differently, and we did. So we have that model, and people have seen, gee, that worked. That was a good thing. And so while the rates of incarceration have gone up some, these moves are happening. These changes are happening.
Yeah, I am also hopeful. You know, we're not the only ones working on this. We have a lot of partners, but there are also a lot of other people who have been tackling these issues. The DC Police Reform Commission put out a report in April. The DC Criminal Code Revision Commission put out a report in May that will overhaul our criminal law if their recommendations are adopted in law. So there is a lot of change afoot. I think the one thing looking forward that we need to keep in mind is that we really need to make sure we are using data to debunk some of the myths that are used to scare people and to prevent change. You know, DC's homicide rate has gone way up the last couple of years, and that is a real thing. And it is a bad thing and an ugly thing. It is also not the same as all crime rising. Crime overall is down. Violent crime overall is down. Homicides is the only category of crime that is up. And so we need to deal with that. We shouldn't be ignoring it. But we also need to really look at the data and talk about what's actually happening and not what people feel like is happening or what the media says is happening or even what our elected leaders say is happening. A couple of months ago, there was a big debate between the mayor and the court that played out in the news, where the mayor was blaming DC Superior Court for the rise in homicides and saying that, oh, they haven't been processing cases because of the pandemic and it's their fault. You know, we took a look at the data and their case processing times haven't changed at all. And so you really need to, you know, crime and safety are things that scare people and should. No one wants to be hurt. No one wants to be harmed. No one wants to see a loved one harmed. But those fears are used against us sometimes in ways that can be really harmful. And it can be very useful to return to the data to figure out what's real and how we can fix the real issues that we have.
And again, just community investments in violence interrupters and in some of the other pilot projects that are underway that have been effective. Let's scale up and again, use the data to support that. And so those discussions are very intense in the budget sessions. And I think we're seeing some movement.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for joining us today to give us not only an overview of the task force and the work that it's done, but the role that data has played and how we also can be part of this change by advocating to see some of those recommendations come to fruition. We really appreciate you joining us.
Thank you for having us. You know,
Yes.
Hogan Lovells is a great firm. We're very happy to get a change that you're engaged in and part of the conversation.
Yeah, thank you all. And I'll drop my email address in the chat. So if anyone wants to, you know, get involved further or has questions, feel free to reach out.
Great. And as a reminder, you do have a link to the task force report in the chat as well that Emily dropped. All right. Thanks so much.
Thank you.